Hello, I'm Jesse Tinoco, and I am doing a chapter discussion on Chapter 6 of the Media Environments textbook 4446 with Professor Asaf. The topic of Chapter 6 is surveillance and freedom. The chapter references some certain films that I recognize. 3 of them here is 1984. I think I remember reading that in high school as well. That's a dystopian novel by George Orwell, Tron Legacy, and I remember watching The Circle. That was literally a film that was signed. The first section of the chapter starts off with the movie 007 and the Spectre of Surveillance, and then just a couple pages is Naomi Wolf's surveil ordinary citizens and infiltrate citizen groups. After that, we get onto Jan Fernbeck's surveillance environments, Google and Facebook. And I believe the last section talked about in this book is Rebecca McKinnon's Consent and Sovereignty and Building a Netizen-Centric Internet. I took notes along the way, and I'm going to discuss these notes I thought was pretty important, or just kind of struck me in some certain way. And then I also hopefully thought of 10 discussions questions. So one of the very first terms that I remember from earlier in the previous chapters is ego media, and I remember that being media that is toward the individual rather than looking out into the world, into the universe, space. Ego media is very individualist. So, common theme with the movies that were discussed in this chapter, there is some sort of surveillance from organizations, from governments. For the James Bond films, he's tracked and under surveillance for most of the film. There's a secretive organization that seeks world domination in 007, and the challenge that's explored with the Spectre organization is how do we battle terrorism with surveillance while ensuring the same surveillance technologies do not wipe out our freedom and privacy, thus also inviting abuse by our own government's corporations. Spectre's surveillance system can be equivalent to a combination of Google, Facebook, the NSA. You know, this book is the biggest big picture book I have ever read in my life, and I'm always most fascinated by the daunting facts of this book. Topic of building the surveillance state, and it's humankind's never-ending greed, power, lust, and warfare has migrated to the internet, and it makes you think how the internet is really not safe. It's controlled by governments, by world leaders. You have the CIA, and you kind of think like everyday people wouldn't be able to know, and it's kind of scary because you kind of assume the worst, that they're tapping into every living room, you know, being an activist or are part of a counterculture, that you can be easily tracked and silenced. Later in that chapter, just a couple sentences later, says the internet is becoming weaponized and dehumanized. Something that this first section really ties me to is the movie The Circle, and just how the main character May becomes this example of someone who is fully transparent, has no secrets because everything is being broadcasted, everything in her life. It really adds an ethical question of, should secrets be allowed? I thought of the effectiveness of protests, and does social media kickstart political mobilization, or has it slowed down with no real organization? A real life example of this would probably be very recent. On TikTok for probably half a year, I saw a post about a general strike happening on October 15th, and naturally, because I am a burnt out adult who thinks that many things about capitalism is wrong, I took part in the strike, and it was on campus at the Quad, and no one was there striking. I kind of thinking, well, it's a college campus, there's usually like-minded individuals who probably want some kind of social change. I was the only one there, and it kind of makes me think, well, maybe that's just what social media is doing nowadays, where people are talking about mobilization, but then it's just not really happening in the real world. It also makes me think about the Black Lives Matter movement of last year, Blackout Tuesday. Social media was every picture is black, every picture is just black. Blackout Tuesday, Blackout Tuesday. What is that really doing for Black Lives Matter? It's bringing awareness, yes, but it's not bringing any real change. And so it makes me think, is real change possible when something gets protested on social media? Another similar question is, how has the ability to post opinions online affected the boundaries of in-person relationships? Because I would think that nowadays you don't need to talk to someone face to face to know what their political affiliation is. You can just go on their social media, and if you see that they have some kind of pro-Trump tweet, then you can assume that they are pro-conservative. And so I think it really comes into like, well, what if this person is a family friend and you don't talk about politics at all with your family, but just because this one aunt, let's say, posted something that's very conservative, conflicting opinions, and it kind of makes me think, well, now on social media, you assume that everything that someone else is posting is access to some sort of personal information that is, I guess, no longer a boundary because it was posted on the internet. We're still in the first section. The subsection heading is the First Amendment as a model for the world. A question that I thought of when reading the section was, can the impacts of misinformation be reversed? And how can it be fixed on the internet? It makes me think about how a reality TV star became president because he was a public figure who knew how to rile up a crowd, I guess. With those 4 years of office came a lot of lies and misinformation. And, well, can misinformation be undone? I think that when something goes to a scale of that magnitude, kind of leaves a scar on society. Shortly after that question, I got onto the definition of doublethink, meaning the power of holding on to two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. To control a society, the powerful must control their behavior and control their thoughts, especially the thinking of the popular media and intellectuals. Doublethink is the form of thought control. Isn't that fascinating? Kind of makes me think how scary the amount of power is really with world leaders. I do think the distribution of power should be way more distributed. Wouldn't that be a good discussion question? What is the ideal number of world leaders in a society as large as our own? Finally, we get into the second section of the chapter, Naomi Wolf's excerpt. It goes right into how the leaders of China are actively invading the privacy of its citizens just so that they can have control over them. And so that makes me think of the question, why do world leaders choose tyranny over community? What would need to happen to make tech access more available to the public for nonprofit community motives? Because I do think that the power on the internet is very difficult to transfer. I think one would know when someone has a lot of power on the internet and regular person, and this makes me think of class. Nobody cares about regular people. People care about the people who actually have influence on the internet, which are celebrities, figures, One of the subsections in this second section is the Iron Triangle in American life, and the question I thought of for that section was, what can help change governmental surveillance to prioritize a thriving society rather than a controlled society? Because I do think with control, I just think of fixed and no room to grow. So how can things be changed so that there's room to grow for everyone, for world leaders, for regular people, for literally opportunity for anyone to be able to go and dedicate their time into a project that will ultimately help society grow? Another question after that, are world leaders beyond making decisions past their own self-interests? Because I think greed is one thing that has definitely been effective to increase disparity between the rich and the poor. And what trait, experience, specialties would an ideal world leader need to ensure a thriving society without disparity? Just thinking of the next stage of capitalism, which would be advanced socialism, which is no disparity, which is just thriving society. The Iron Triangle section also, I'm going to quote, dictatorships want citizens to know they are being watched. So the question that I thought of is surveillance prison? Another quote right here: dictatorships use citizen surveillance in a clear way to blackmail and coerce the people, especially critics. So question for wonder here is, what is the toll on mental health? This just makes me think of the hopelessness of the current generation, Generation Z. What's the toll on mental health? Does carelessness equal hopelessness? Thinking about it, a generation has been born into this very real, pardon my language, but like a clusterfuck of information and misinformation and conflict and war and discourse. And so, will they eventually stop caring? Ending the second section here, I want to read this last sentence from the second to last paragraph. Be mindful while you pursue your activism. I have no idea what the lengths that governments are doing to surveil people. I know that it's more extreme in other countries than others. How extreme is it in America? Are we doomed from too much surveillance? Are we doomed, period? Yeah, just hopeless thoughts. In this section, surveillance environments, the definition: surveillance is a process of concentrated monitoring of human details for the purposes of control. Communication technologies serve as obvious devices for surveillance and control. In this subsection, the evolution of surveillance, I underlined: we are targets of consumer and government surveillance that expose us and big data subjects, yet we track ourselves, our loved ones, using the same technologies as a form of play and entertainment. A question that I thought of right there is it possible to disconnect surveillance to entertainment and personal communication? In the subsection, loss of privacy, I underlined: our private thoughts and private lives are what makes us free and dignified individuals. Surveillance threatens to expose those private thoughts, our private selves, by allowing access to the bits and pieces that constitute our behaviors and ourselves. The next paragraph starts off with: privacy is also about controlling information about ourselves. And I really hope that the line of privacy doesn't get blurred any more than it already is, but honestly, there is no telling how far off. We are in our last section of Recca McCannon's excerpt here on From Consent of the Networked. And I think George Orwell's 1984 has been used in a lot of these authors' texts, but I think McKinnon does a really good job at simplifying it in terms that in the last paragraph of Consent and Sovereignty, the subsection, I have underlined: the greatest long-term threat to a genuinely citizen-centric society, a world in which technology and government serve citizens instead of the other way around, looks like Orwell's 1984. In the subsection, Utopianism versus Reality, we're getting into some really intense stuff, and my mind is having an information overload at this point. But it goes into activism, and I underlined right here, third paragraph starts: on a practical level, activists cannot wait for the ideal world to be built. The point of activism is to reach, convince, and engage the largest number of people as quickly and effectively as possible. And yes, why am I like this? I know it doesn't make me happy. But yeah, I would say in this age, if you're an activist, be informed. Be informed until the point where it hurts, because your power is very little compared to the power of those individuals that rule society. Yeah, I really think that unionization is the best method, but I do think that in a social media world where it is very superficial and it is very individualist, unionization on social media just isn't the same as unionization in real life, and I think that it actually slows change. Are those legit thoughts? I hope so. Another question to think about: is activism shadow banning happening throughout the entire internet platforms? How can we make sure, and how can it be stopped? Something that I saw when TikTok became the most trending app was just a bunch of comments of revolutions. I know that there's been revolutions in Portugal, there's been revolutions all over the world. I've seen videos on TikTok of people with their lives in risk. You hear bombs going off in the background saying like, hey man, we're terrified. Someone please interact with this video so that it blows up, because you know this isn't being talked about in the news. And how can we know what's really shadow banned, and how can we know that every time we try to make a change there isn't already someone trying to stop it. CIA, man, I don't trust them. Actually, we're gonna end it right there. Thank you very much for joining me in this in-depth discussion on Chapter 6, Surveillance and Freedom.